On the evening of September 30th, 1938, tens of thousands of people packed the streets outside 10 Downing Street. They were cheering. Women were crying with relief. A prime minister who had just returned from Germany stepped up to a window, held up a single sheet of paper with Adolf Hitler's signature on it, and told a crowd that Britain had secured peace for our time. People went home that night believing the worst had been avoided. Newspapers the next morning ran headlines calling it a triumph. In Paris, crowds did the exact same thing for their own prime minister. For one brief moment, an entire continent exhaled. 336 days later, German bombers were over Poland, British and French ambassadors were handing Berlin ultimatums, and the war that Munich was supposed to prevent had already begun. Less than a year. That is the gap between peace for our time and the deadliest conflict in human history starting in earnest. And the strange, uncomfortable question sitting underneath that gap is this: how did a deal that was celebrated in the streets of London and Paris as a rescue from catastrophe end up becoming the single most notorious word in the vocabulary of diplomatic failure? Why does Munich still get invoked by American presidents and senators, nearly 90 years later, every single time the country debates whether to confront a dictator or make a deal with one? To understand that, you cannot just look at the 2 days the leaders spent in a Munich conference room. You have to go back further, into a piece of land most Americans have never heard of, populated by people caught in the middle of a fight that was never really about them. The land nobody agreed on. The Sudetenland was not a country. It was a horseshoe-shaped ring of mountainous border territory wrapped around the western and northern edge of Czechoslovakia, and it happened to be home to roughly 3 million people who spoke German as their native language. This was not some strange historical accident. Ethnic Germans had lived in Bohemia and Moravia for centuries, going back to medieval settlement patterns under the Holy Roman Empire. When the map of Europe was redrawn after the First World War, the victorious Allies created Czechoslovakia as a brand new state built out of the wreckage of the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire. The new country was led by President Edvard Beneš and before him, the philosopher-statesman Tomáš Masaryk, and it governed a genuinely diverse population, roughly 10 million Czechs, 3 million Slovaks, 3 million German speakers, along with Hungarians, Ukrainians, and Poles, all inside one set of borders. Here is the part that should stop you for a second, because it is the seed of everything that follows. The entire justification for the new map of Europe after World War I was the principle of self-determination, the idea that people should get to govern themselves rather than be ruled by empires. Woodrow Wilson had championed this idea at Versailles. And yet, when the borders were actually drawn, 3 million German speakers ended up inside a Slavic majority state they had never voted to join, rather than being attached to Austria or Germany. The Allies had good strategic reasons for this. Those border regions contain the overwhelming majority of Czechoslovakia's industrial base, roughly 80% of its coal and lignite, 70% of its metallurgical industry, most of its textile production, and nearly all of its glass and china manufacturing. Strip that territory away, and you strip away the country's ability to defend or sustain itself. So the borders were drawn for economic and strategic logic, not ethnic logic, and that contradiction sat there, mostly quiet, for about 15 years. Hitler finds his opening. Adolf Hitler did not invent German grievance in the Sudetenland. He exploited it. Beginning in 1933, the same year Hitler took power in Berlin, a Sudeten German politician named Konrad Henlein founded the Sudeten German Party. By 1935, in Czechoslovakia's parliamentary elections, Henlein's party won roughly 3 out of every 5 votes cast by ethnic Germans, making it the second largest party in the entire country. Henlein publicly insisted his movement simply wanted autonomy within Czechoslovakia. Privately, and this only became fully clear later through captured German documents, he was taking direction from Berlin, and his real function was to manufacture a crisis that Hitler could use as a pretext. And Hitler needed that pretext, because his ambitions were never really about the Sudeten Germans. They were about German power. He had already shown his hand twice. In March 1936, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone under the Treaty of Versailles, and neither France nor Britain lifted a finger to stop him. In March 1938, he absorbed Austria entirely in what became known as the Anschluss, again without resistance from the other great powers. Each time Hitler tested the water, and each time the water did nothing. By the time he turned his attention to Czechoslovakia in 1938, every reason to believe a third gamble would pay off just as easily as the first two. Starting that year, Nazi propaganda began pushing a narrative that ethnic Germans inside Czechoslovakia were being persecuted, oppressed, and denied basic rights by the Czech-dominated government in Prague. Some of this had a kernel of truth. Sudeten Germans had grievances, particularly economic ones tied to the Great Depression, hitting the heavily industrial border regions especially hard. But the scale of oppression Nazi propaganda described was manufactured almost entirely for external consumption, a justification engineered in Berlin to make an aggressive land grab look like a humanitarian rescue. The Anschluss with Austria, completed just months earlier in March 1938, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the direct rehearsal for everything that followed. Hitler had three things working in his favor there: real support from a meaningful share of the Austrian population, an Austrian army with essentially no capacity to resist a German invasion, and a promise from Mussolini that Italy would not intervene. German troops crossed the border. Austrian radio urged the population not to resist, and within days Austria had simply ceased to exist as an independent country, absorbed whole into the Reich. Britain and France issued formal protests and did nothing else. For Hitler, the lesson of Austria was not a warning. It was a blueprint. He had just proven, to his own satisfaction, that Europe's great powers would talk loudly and act not at all. Czechoslovakia was next, and this time he had a built-in justification sitting right there waiting to be exploited, an actual ethnic German minority inside an actual neighboring state that Hitleri's party could be used to agitate on Berlin's behalf. The crisis builds through the summer of 1938. By May 1938, tensions had escalated to the point that Czechoslovakia, acting on intelligence suggesting a German troop buildup near its border, ordered a partial mobilization of its own military. War seemed close enough that Britain and France both signaled support for Czechoslovakia if fighting broke out. The moment passed without conflict, but it rattled everyone involved. It convinced Hitler that he needed to accelerate his timeline rather than slow it down. Through the summer, the rhetoric out of Germany grew sharper. On September 12, 1938, at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, Hitler delivered a speech accusing Czechoslovakia of, in his words, subjecting Sudeten Germans to unbearable persecution, and he demanded that their right to self-determination be respected. Sudeten German paramilitary groups, organized and armed with support from Nazi Germany, launched what historians now describe as a low-intensity uprising along the border beginning around September 17th, with armed clashes, sabotage, and attempts to seize border posts. Czechoslovak security forces pushed back hard enough that the uprising was largely contained within about 2 weeks, but the violence gave Hitler exactly the images and headlines he wanted: chaos on the border, German blood supposedly being spilled, a crisis that demanded resolution. That is the moment Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene personally. Chamberlain's 3 flights. Neville Chamberlain had never flown on an airplane before 1938. He was 69 years old, a cautious, methodical man from a prominent political family who genuinely, sincerely believed that the First World War had been such an unbearable catastrophe that avoiding a second one justified almost any diplomatic sacrifice. He was not naive in the way people sometimes caricature him. He understood Hitler was dangerous. He simply believed that reasonable concessions, offered in good faith, could contain that danger rather than provoke it further. This was the guiding assumption behind everything he did in September 1938. On September 15th, Chamberlain flew to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, for a face-to-face meeting. Hitler told him plainly that he intended to have the Sudetenland, by war if necessary, and that the only question was whether the transfer would happen peacefully. Chamberlain flew home and, remarkably, convinced his own cabinet and the French government to accept the principle that any Sudeten German area with more than 50% German population should be ceded to Germany, based on a plebiscite. This was already a staggering concession, made without Czechoslovakia even being consulted. The SS government was simply informed that Britain and France expected it to comply, and under enormous pressure, on September 21st, Czechoslovakia reluctantly accepted the terms. Chamberlain then flew back to Germany a week later, on September 22nd, this time to the town of Bad Godesberg on the Rhine, fully expecting to finalize the deal he thought he already had. Instead, Hitler moved the goalposts. He now demanded not a gradual, plebiscite-based transfer, but immediate German military occupation of the Sudetenland, with Czechoslovak forces required to withdraw by October 1st. He handed Chamberlain a written ultimatum, the Godesberg Memorandum, giving the Czechs until 2 p.m. on September 28th to accept, with vaguely defined plebiscites to follow later in territory that would, by then, already be under German military control. Even Chamberlain, who badly wanted an agreement, could not sell these terms to his own government. Lord Halifax, his own foreign secretary, told the cabinet bluntly that Hitler had given them nothing, that it was, in Halifax's words, as if he had won a war without having to fight one. Chamberlain wrote directly to Hitler warning that if Germany attacked Czechoslovakia and France honored its treaty obligations, Britain would feel bound to support France. Behind the scenes, Hitler briefly pushed his own military mobilization back by 24 hours, reportedly telling Hermann Göring that he was worried the British fleet might actually open fire after all. It was, for one of the only moments in the entire crisis, a genuinely open question which way things would break. Europe prepares for war. For about 72 hours, in late September 1938, it genuinely looked like Europe was about to go to war. Britain ordered the Royal Navy to mobilize. Trenches were dug in London's parks. Air raid sirens were tested. Gas masks were distributed to civilians, including children, because the fear of German aerial bombing of cities was one of the defining anxieties of the era. In Prague, President Beneš ordered a general mobilization, and more than 1 million Czechoslovak soldiers reported for duty. France, bound to Czechoslovakia by treaty, called up reservists. On September 27th, Chamberlain addressed the British public by radio and said something that has been quoted ever since as the emotional core of appeasement's logic. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it was, he said, that Britain should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom, as he put it, we know nothing. That line tells you almost everything about the mindset driving British policy. Czechoslovakia, to most ordinary British and French citizens, was an abstraction. It had existed as an independent country for only 20 years. Few people in London or Paris could locate the Sudetenland on a map, and fewer still were prepared to send their sons to die defending its borders. This was not cowardice in any simple sense. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men in the First World War, a war that had begun, from the British perspective, over a tangle of alliance obligations in the Balkans that most people had also never fully understood. The generation making decisions in 1938 had lived through that, and they were terrified of repeating it. It's also worth pausing here on something Americans specifically should understand, because it connects directly back to the United States. One of the loudest voices shaping British elite opinion about German air power that autumn was an American, Charles Lindbergh. Acting on behalf of American military intelligence, Lindbergh had made multiple trips into Nazi Germany between 1936 and 1938, touring German aircraft factories and airfields with remarkable access. He came away convinced and told British officials directly that the Luftwaffe was so overwhelming that it could defeat the combined air forces of Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia simultaneously. One senior British conservative, Thomas Jones, wrote in his diary that after a single conversation with Lindbergh, he had shifted from favoring resistance to Hitler toward favoring peace at almost any cost, specifically because of how Lindbergh described British unpreparedness in the air. Lindbergh delivered this message to British officers roughly a week before Munich, and those officers passed his assessment directly up to Chamberlain. Historians still debate how much weight to give this single factor, but it is a real thread, and it is an American thread, running straight into the decision-making that produced the Munich Agreement. America in the fall of 1938 was, in almost every practical sense, bystander to all of this, and understanding why matters as much as understanding what was happening in Munich itself. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts throughout the 1930s specifically designed to prevent the country from being pulled into another European war the way it had been in 1917. Memories of that war, and of the roughly 116,000 American dead it had produced, were still raw enough that isolationism was not a fringe position in American politics. It was closer to the mainstream. The America First movement, which would formally organize as a committee a few years later, drew on exactly this sentiment, that Europe's quarrels were Europe's business and that the ocean separating the United States from the continent was there for a reason. President Franklin Roosevelt, watching from Washington, took a different approach. On September 26th and again on September 27th, he sent personal telegrams directly to Hitler, urging him to keep negotiating rather than resort to force, warning of what he called the incalculable disaster that would result from a European war, and proposing an international conference to settle the dispute peacefully. Hitler wrote back insisting the decision for war or peace rested entirely with Czechoslovakia, not Germany, a claim that was, to put it plainly, the opposite of the truth, since Hitler himself had manufactured the entire crisis. Roosevelt's intervention reflected the deep contradiction inside American foreign policy at the time. The country was firmly isolationist, bound by neutrality laws Congress had passed specifically to keep America out of another European war, and public opinion had little appetite for entanglement. Yet Roosevelt personally understood, earlier than most American politicians were willing to say out loud, exactly what kind of threat Hitler represented. Munich. It was Mussolini, of all people, who offered Chamberlain a way out of the immediate crisis. On September 28th, with the Godesberg deadline having passed and war looking hours away, the Italian dictator proposed a four-power conference in Munich, bringing together Germany, Italy, Britain, and France to settle the matter. Crucially, neither Czechoslovakia nor the Soviet Union, despite the fact that Moscow had a mutual defense treaty with Prague, was invited to attend. Chamberlain announced the conference to the House of Commons, and members of Parliament reportedly stood and cheered with relief at the news that war might still be avoided. The four leaders met in Munich on September 29th and, working through the night, signed the Munich Agreement in the early hours of September 30th, 1938. The terms were, in substance, almost identical to what Hitler had already demanded at Godesberg. Czechoslovakia would surrender the Sudetenland, including its border fortifications, to Germany. German troops would occupy the territory in stages between October 1st and October 10th. An international commission would later determine the fate of a handful of remaining disputed areas. Two Czechoslovak representatives had traveled to Munich and were sitting in a nearby hotel room while all of this was decided. They were not permitted into the negotiating room. They were informed of the terms only after the four powers had already agreed to them and told, essentially, to accept or face the consequences alone, since neither Britain nor France was willing to honor its commitments to Czechoslovakia if it refused. Beneš's government, isolated and abandoned by its allies, accepted. Before leaving Munich, Chamberlain asked Hitler for one more private meeting and produced a short prepared statement declaring that Britain and Germany regarded the agreement, along with the earlier Anglo-German naval agreement, as symbolic of the two nations' desire never to go to war with one another again. Hitler signed it. Chamberlain flew home, and at Heston Aerodrome outside London, he held that piece of paper up for the cameras and read from it, telling the assembled crowd that he believed it represented peace for our time. Later that day, from the window of 10 Downing Street, he told the cheering crowd below to go home and, in his words, sleep quietly in your beds. The bill comes due. Not everyone in Britain was celebrating. Winston Churchill, at that point a backbench member of Parliament largely regarded as a warmonger and a political relic, rose in the House of Commons on October 5, 1938, and delivered one of the most prescient speeches of the 20th century. He called the agreement a total and unmitigated defeat and told Chamberlain directly, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." He went further, warning the House not to imagine this was the end, calling it instead only the first sip, the first foretaste, of a bitter cup that will be proffered to Britain year by year unless the nation recover its moral health and its martial vigor. The House of Commons voted overwhelmingly, 366 to 144, to support the government's handling of the crisis. Churchill was, in that room, on that day, very much in the minority. It's worth being precise here, because the numbers around Czechoslovakia's actual military position are more sobering than the popular memory of Munich usually allows. By the time of the crisis, Czechoslovakia had mobilized more than 1 million men and possessed a modern, well-equipped army built around the country's own formidable arms industry, centered on the Skoda Works, one of the largest weapons manufacturers in Europe. Along its border with Germany, the country had built roughly 10,000 light pillboxes and over 1,000 planned heavy fortifications modeled loosely on France's Maginot Line, of which around 260 heavy positions were fully complete by the time of Munich, with many more near enough to completion to serve as functional shelters. German military planners at the time were acutely aware that their own forces lacked the heavy siege equipment needed to punch through those defenses quickly. This is not speculation dreamed up after the fact to make Munich look worse in hindsight. It reflects genuine, documented anxiety inside the German High Command in 1938 about whether an invasion of Czechoslovakia could succeed without a costly, grinding fight. When Germany did eventually get its hands on those fortifications without firing a shot, its engineers studied them closely and used the lessons to help design the tactics that broke through Belgian and French defenses less than 2 years later. The material cost to Czechoslovakia was staggering, and it is worth sitting with the actual numbers rather than treating this as an abstraction. The country lost more than 11,000 square miles of territory and roughly a third of its total population, including around 800,000 ethnic Czechs who now found themselves living inside the German Reich, along with more than 150,000 people, many of them Jewish or politically opposed to the Nazi regime, who fled the Sudetenland for the Czech interior in the days after the agreement. More devastating still, Czechoslovakia lost the overwhelming majority of its border fortifications, an elaborate system of bunkers and defensive works that the country had spent years in, by some estimates, over half its government budget between 1936 and 1938 constructing specifically to deter a German invasion. Some historians and military analysts have since argued, based on the state of German preparedness at the time, that a well-defended, well-fortified Czechoslovakia, backed by its treaty allies, might genuinely have been able to repel or at least badly bloody a German invasion in the fall of 1938. Germany's own generals were nervous enough about the prospect that a group of them had been quietly discussing a plot to remove Hitler from power if he pushed the country into a war it wasn't yet ready to fight. Munich removed that possibility entirely, and removed it without a single shot being fired. Sleep quietly in your beds. For about 5 months, the agreement appeared on the surface to hold. Then, on March 15, 1939, German troops crossed what remained of the Czechoslovak border and occupied Prague itself. Slovakia had already declared independence as a German client state the day before, engineered directly by Berlin. Hitler declared the remaining Czech territory, Bohemia and Moravia, a German protectorate. Hungary, opportunistically, seized the remainder of a region called Ruthenia. Czechoslovakia, the country the Munich Agreement had claimed to be protecting from war, ceased to exist as an independent state entirely, and Hitler had done it without even the pretense of a Sudeten German grievance to justify at this time, because there was no significant German population left to claim. The mask, briefly, came all the way off. This is the detail that made Munich fail as a strategy, not just as a moral judgment in hindsight. The entire premise of Chamberlain's approach was that Hitler's ambitions were limited and specific, that satisfying the Sudeten German grievance would resolve the underlying tension. The occupation of Prague proved, immediately and undeniably, that this premise was false. Hitler was not seeking to right a specific historical wrong. He was pursuing open-ended territorial expansion, and every concession simply confirmed to him that the Western powers would not stop him. Chamberlain, to his credit, adjusted. Within days of the occupation of Prague, Britain extended a formal guarantee of military support to Poland, explicitly warning Hitler that any attempt to seize Polish territory by force would mean war with Britain and France. This was the line London finally decided it would not let Hitler cross. Ironically, this guarantee helped push Hitler toward one of the most cynical alliances in modern history. Needing to avoid a two-front war while he dealt with Poland, Hitler struck a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union in August 1939, a deal that included a secret protocol carving up Poland and the Baltic states between the two dictatorships. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. Britain and France, honoring the guarantee they had made after Munich failed, declared war on Germany on September 3. The Second World War had begun, less than a year after Chamberlain told a cheering crowd to sleep quietly in their beds. Was it ever going to work? Historians still argue about how to judge Chamberlain, and it's worth giving that argument its full weight rather than flattening it into a simple story of villainy or stupidity. The traditional view, cemented almost immediately after the war and reinforced by Churchill's own hugely influential memoirs, treats Munich as a moment of pure moral and strategic failure, a betrayal of a small ally that only emboldened a dictator who could have been stopped earlier at a much lower cost. This view has an enormous amount of evidence behind it: the loss of Czechoslovakia's fortifications and industrial base, the fact that German generals themselves doubted their readiness for a wider war in 1938, and the plain, brutal fact that appeasement did not produce peace, only a delay of about 11 months. A more revisionist school of historians, gaining ground particularly from the 1990s onward, has argued that Chamberlain's choice, however distasteful in retrospect, bought Britain something genuinely valuable: nearly a full year of additional time to expand aircraft production, particularly the fighter planes and radar stations that would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain in 1940. British and German air production statistics from 1938 into 1939 do show a real acceleration on the British side during exactly this window. Whether that gain was worth the price Czechoslovakia paid, whether a fight in 1938 might have gone better than the fight that eventually came in 1939, and whether Hitler could genuinely have been stopped earlier at all remain open, seriously contested questions among historians rather than settled facts. What is not seriously contested is that the specific goal Chamberlain set out to achieve at Munich, A durable peace secured through negotiated concession failed completely and quickly. Why this still matters in America? This is not just a story about British and German diplomacy from nearly a century ago. Munich became, almost immediately after 1939, a kind of permanent reference point in American foreign policy debates, shorthand for the argument that negotiating with an aggressive power only invites further aggression. American presidents have invoked it explicitly and repeatedly across decades of foreign policy decisions, from the Korean War through the Cold War standoffs, and the word still gets thrown around in Washington debates today whenever the country argues about whether to negotiate with a hostile foreign power or hold a hard line. The lesson people draw from it, rightly or wrongly, has shaped how American leaders think about credibility, deterrence, and the cost of looking weak in front of an adversary for nearly 90 years. Very few single diplomatic agreements in modern history have left that kind of permanent mark on how an entire country reasons about the world. And there is a harder, more uncomfortable layer underneath the strategic lesson, which is the human one. The Czechoslovak delegation sat in a hotel room in Munich while 4 other countries decided their nation's fate without them in the room. Millions of people who had never been consulted woke up one morning as subjects of a regime they had spent years trying to keep out. The Munich Agreement is, at its core, a story about what happens to a country that is small, that is far away, and that other, more powerful nations decide isn't worth the risk of war to defend, right up until the moment that calculation turns out to be catastrophically wrong. Chamberlain wanted peace. He got war anyway, on worse terms, a moment his adversary had chosen rather than one he had chosen himself. That is the actual lesson sitting underneath the phrase peace for our time, and it is why, all these decades later, the story of a mountainous stretch of borderland most Americans still couldn't point to on a map remains one of the most studied cautionary tales in modern history.